Hi, I'm Zibby Owens, and you're listening to the award-winning podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. If you like this podcast, you will love my new anthology called Moms Don't Have Time to Have Kids. Check it out, and you'll hear from 49 authors about all sorts of things moms don't have time to do. All the authors have been on this podcast. Also, check out my TikTok with Zibby and Tracy, my other podcast, Sex Talk with Zibby and Tracy. Check out Moms Don't Have Time to Write on Medium. And of course, my new publishing company called Zibby Books. And now back to our daily author interview site and a quick hello from some of my kids. Hi. Hi. Hello. Enjoy the show. If you like this podcast, you will love my new anthology called Moms Don't Have Time to Have Kids. Here's a little snippet by one of the authors from the anthology.
My name is Rex Ogle, author of Free Lunch, and I'm stoked to have contributed to Moms Don't Have Time to Have Kids. My essay is called Historias sobre mí, Stories About Me, and what I really don't have time for is making time for self-care, but I'm learning to make time, and so should you.
Amor Towles is the author of The Lincoln Highway. He's also the author of the New York Times bestsellers Rules of Civility, which I adored, and A Gentleman in Moscow. The two novels have collectively sold more than 4 million copies and have been translated into more than 30 languages. Towles lives in Manhattan with his wife and 2 children. Welcome, Amor. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to discuss The Lincoln Highway and all of your work and everything else.
Thanks, Zibby. Thanks for having me.
I have to tell you that I read The Rules of Civility with my book club years ago when it first came out, and still it remains one of my favorite books. So good, so amazing. And then I went and saw you speak somewhere related to that book ages ago. This is like embarrassing now that I'm like stalking you. But anyway, I was such a huge super fan and now have like been following along with you. So I'm delighted to get to talk to you about this book.
Great. Terrific.
Yes. Okay. The Lincoln Highway. Would you mind just telling listeners a little more about what it's about and how you came up with the idea for this book?
The Lincoln Highway, sort of the background is that before our story begins, as it were, an honorable young Nebraskan goes to the county fair with his little brother. A bully picks a fight with him at the fair. He punches the bully. The bully falls back, hits his head, and dies. As a result, Emmett, our hero, is sentenced to 18 months in a juvenile work farm. The book opens on the day that Emmett has been released, and the warden is driving him home to Nebraska. In the meantime, Emmett's mother is long gone, but in the meantime, while he was away, his father has passed away, and the family farm has gone into foreclosure. And the warden is saying to Emmett that he's an honorable young man, that what happened at the fair was a freak accident, that he has paid his debt to society. So what he really should do is be prepared to start his life anew. Emmett says that's exactly what his intention is to do. He's going to pick up his younger brother, get in his car, and head west to start his adulthood, as it were. But when the warden drives away, it turns out the 2 young friends from the work farm have hidden themselves in the trunk of the warden's car, and they have a very different vision for Emmett's future. And so as a result, instead of piling in the car and heading west, Emmett, his little brother, and his 2 friends end up heading east on the Lincoln Highway towards New York City with everything going awry. So this is kind of the way the story begins, and it's in whole story only lasts 10 days, and it takes place in June of 1954.
I have to say, when I first heard about the story, I wasn't imagining the inmates. I wasn't thinking that one of them was going to be like a trust fund kid from the Upper East Side, which is sort of where I am right now, and one, Dutchess County and all of this stuff. Like I was surprised by the fall from grace and how they got there and how that sort of reverberates in a lot of your stories. People
Sure.
who've come from wealth or who are going, falling from their stations, even the dad himself, right?
People from boarding school get themselves into trouble all the time. Where are you? Where are you right now?
I'm in New York City, but actually like 3 feet away. My son is here from boarding school right now. So
okay, yeah. Tell him to keep out of trouble.
I know.
Right? I don't go to the Hamptons, but certainly there are young people in the Hamptons getting themselves into trouble too. So, I think if you looked at a juvenile program, it may be a mix. And just as if you went to a rehab program, it may be a mix of kids from very different walks of life. And so that, yes, one of the things that happens in this story is 3 kids who might never have come to know each other in the course of a normal life. The mistakes that each of the three have made has put them in a position where they suddenly meet each other, come to know each other, become friends, and their fates become a little bit more intertwined.
Yes. It is always so random, the people you end up crossing your paths with in different arenas, not necessarily in the trunk of a car, but I was also really interested in how Emmett sort of decided to become a carpenter's apprentice, and that he couldn't deal with how out of control it was to be a farmer, right? And you had to be so dependent on the weather and all these things. And then he decided to apprentice to earn extra money with a carpenter. And the way he conceptualized both those professions, that he didn't have to worry, all the things that had plagued his father and his family. Like, if you are a carpenter, you're always going to have work. Like, you don't have to worry. So I just thought, for someone from such a young age, that was a very interesting sort of insight. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I suppose the bigger context in what you're describing is really the book is about three 18-year-old boys, roughly, a 19-year-old young woman. There's an 8-year-old, too, who plays a critical part of the story. But if you think about those four figures who are all around 18, 19, 20 years old, that's a point in your life, or in our lives, that is kind of universally. It's a sort of interesting moment, because if you think about our lives between 0 and 16, that's a period where we are receiving all kinds of input, instruction, counsel from our parents, from school, from our church, from the community around us, whatever shared values our community has. All of them are constantly, speaking to young people before the age of 16, providing them advice, guidance, telling them stories in one form or another. And all this is really to shape the young individual and to help define who they are and how they view right and wrong, where they draw their lines, what they think is possible for themselves, what they think is essential to do. All these things are being passed to us. But you get to around 17, 18, 19, and suddenly the compass spins, as it were, and those suddenly we realize as young 17, 18, 19-year-olds, wait, I can make my own decisions about who I am, about what I want to do with my life, about what is right and wrong. And when we make that transition, either consciously or unconsciously, both happen, we take all those inputs from our youth and we amplify some and we discard others. And there are kids who very self-consciously want to be like their father. Let's say a son wants to be like father. There are kids who very self-consciously reject their father's choices, even if their father's an honorable person. They must say, the life that my father has chosen is alien to me, anathema to me, and I would no sooner do X than jump off a cliff. And so you can have both sort of moments occur. And yes, all three of the young men in this case, and Sally, the young woman too, they are at that moment in their lives, and they are very conscious of the lives that their parents lead. And they have inherited both problems and wisdom from their parents to varying degrees. And they are defining their lives in contrast in some cases. And so, yes, for Emmett, being raised in a farm by a father who wasn't a natural farmer and seeing the ongoing struggles that has created for him and that they've had to share as a family, it's very natural for him to be like, no, this is not for me, and so, but as I say, that's just sort of a part of the bigger mosaic of individual decision-making at that point. And the story investigates many different kinds of decisions that the young characters are making in a similar type of context.
Yes. This is how I feel about going into finance, by the way. Like I would rather be nailing,
Oh, actually, because your parent, you have parents.
I have a family in finance, so I'm like, let me just read books all day. Thank you very much. Didn't you have a background in finance, or did I make that up? Didn't you start out that way?
Well, I spent 20 years in the investment business. Yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah. And I saw pictures, by the way, on your Instagram of the Lincoln Highway, and I didn't realize how the way it was paved, like even today, it still has bricks and all of that. Like, that was such a visually arresting image. Is that really, do you know what I'm talking about or not?
No, of course. The Lincoln Highway, which the book draws the name from, is the first highway that crossed America. So in the early 20th century, as the car was gaining in popularity across the country, the vast majority of roads in the United States were, first of all, were unpaved. And so the dirt roads, which were okay for horses in rain, proved to be more difficult for cars. So cars would have difficulty navigating these roads if they became muddy, for instance. But in addition, the roads weren't really designed for long distance travel. They were designed to get you from the farm into a town, or, from the train depot to your house. And, that's what roads were for. So they spiderwebbed out from townships and municipalities. What they weren't really designed to do was to go from, say, Boston to Salt Lake City. Nobody was doing that. And there was if you wanted to go from Boston to Salt Lake City, you took a train, and you certainly didn't take a carriage. So, or a car. So an American entrepreneur by the name of Carl Fisher, who believed that Americans, now that they had cars, would want to see their country and should see their country, decided that he would build a paved road that crossed the country from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, specifically from Times Square to San Francisco. At the time, the federal government wasn't involved in road making at all. And so it ended up being a private venture. He raised money from the public and barnstormed to raise money. And eventually he raised enough money, whatever in today's terms, millions of dollars, and the road was built. Now, the reason I go through all this is because it's not like they had one crew who started in Times Square and paved the roads slowly across the nation 3,000 miles later. What, of course, they did is his notion was, we're going to raise money all across the country, and the individual counties in which the road is going to cut through will be a part of, they'll take over their zone, and each, so simultaneously, groups would be building the road all across the country, county by county, for, once the line was drawn and where it was going to be. Now, so that meant that to some degree, the roads, how they were made, did differ from place to place. And in Omaha, Nebraska, there is a stretch which has not been tinkered with for 100 years, really. And that, yes, a photograph is I just posted on my Instagram account recently. That is a bricked segment. Now, that's not a coincidence. It's because, and it's a red brick road. It's not a yellow brick road, but it's not a coincidence, because if you actually go not far from there to, for instance, Aurora, Nebraska, which is right in the middle of Nebraska, there were brickworks in those counties. And so, they didn't have cobblestones, they had bricks. And it was a very easy thing to, sort of the notion of we'll use bricks. If you go to Aurora, Nebraska today, the downtown area around the town hall, all the streets are brick, in that specific, area. So it's not as if the Lincoln Highway was brick from the beginning to end. It's just that in that segment, it was brick. And for whatever reason, that little segment has not been touched for 100 years. So it is kind of it's a fun sort of little window on what that segment of road looked like.
Wow. Oh my gosh, I love that. I just wanted to read this one part about Emmett, and when he finds something special from his father tucked away in the car, and it's about books themselves. So I just wanted to read this thing about how he doesn't approve, or his dad had never approved of ripping out books. And yet here's a page. He said, his father made painfully clear that night to deface the pages of a book was to adopt the manner of a Visigoth. It was to strike a blow against the most sacred and noble of man's achievements, the ability to set down his finest ideas and sentiments so that they might be shared through the ages. For his father to tear a page from any book was sacrilege. What was even more shocking was that the page was torn from Ralph Waldo Emerson's Essays, that book which his father held in greater esteem than any other. So is this something you share? Do you have a feeling about ripping pages out of books? Like, was this a thing in your family too?
Well, my books are an invention. So they are not expressions of my family behavior.
I was just wondering if that stemmed from anywhere. That was my one personal question.
Emmett, in that story, Emmett got in trouble for defacing a book and was sent home by the principal, in essence, and his father was furious. That did not happen to me. So, but of course, I think most of us witness some version of that at some point in our lives. So I think it's probably a pretty universal situation where in elementary school, some kid starts drawing in the books, and a particularly traditional teacher will be furious and say, what are you doing? You can't be drawing in the books, and not allowed. So, somewhere along the way, somebody expresses to us the elevated importance of books and taking care of books and showing them respect, whether it's a librarian or a parent, or as I say, a teacher. And so, no, that was not a family thing, but I do think it's probably a universal moment. But yes, I liked sort of the contrast there that the father wants to, since the farm's in foreclosure, he doesn't have much to leave his son. And so, he leaves him advice, and he leaves him advice from his hero, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great American middle of the 19th century reverend and essayist and philosopher. That's what he leaves him, and as Emmett says, here's a guy, he both loved Emerson, prized the book, hated the defacing of books, and yet tore out this, passage, before he died to give his son. And therefore it kind of has sort of the weight of all these things behind it. It's something that you should take all the more seriously for the fact that for his father to do it, it was contrary even to his own normal, rules. It must be an important passage. And of course, in the way of books, Emmett's ability to understand that passage at that point in the story is very different than his ability to understand that passage at the end of the story. And, I'll leave that for others to figure out on their own. ... Yes.
I watched the video you posted somewhere, I saw somewhere, about your very different books. And obviously all three have been quite different in terms of form and character and everything. And you go into why. Why did some take place over multiple decades, whereas some take place over 10 days or in a summer or whatever, and even different time periods and types of people. And it sounded like you are it's like you're like a master craftsman who has to try a new challenge each time, right? That's the way it's like you wanted to hone your craft by trying different things. So tell me about that and why you see it working so well to sort of jump time periods or format or structure, and what your plans are from here.
All right. First of all, I don't think of myself as a master craftsman, but I do think of myself as a craftsperson, or however you want to put it. But different writers are trying to achieve different things in their writing, and sometimes trying to achieve different things in different books. But yes, as a novelist, I am very interested in how elements of craft can be used to achieve different types of narratives and different types of outcomes artistically and philosophically. So when from my standpoint, when you shift a story for, a decade, and you shift the focus from, one age group to another, and you shift the central focus of the story from, a happy event to a tragic event, or whatever these little elements are that distinguish one story from another. For me, one part of the thing that's interesting about that as a challenge is that virtually that every element of craft should change along with those simple facts, and so meaning that, to tell these two different stories, one let's say it's, like this story in the mid 50s. If this story were, 13 years later, 15, 14 years later, it was 1968, and you still had an 18-year-old, what a radically different tone and poetics you would need to bring to bear to tell that story. Because, life for an 18-year-old in America in 1968, you've got the Vietnam War, you're on the verge of Woodstock, you've got rock and roll is booming, you've got, a counterculture, you've got free love movement in San Francisco, you've got a lot of going on. And, which is not happening in 1954, not even a generation before, half a generation before, it's a completely different landscape. And so in tackling a story about an 18-year-old in either one of those moments in time, as I say, the vocabulary would clearly be different, but so would the semantics, and so would the imagery, and so would how the poetics work, and the tone of the dialogue would be different. How settings are described would be different. The pace of the book might be different. Certainly the themes at the center are going to be different, and that's going to reverberate back through how the language is chosen and formed. So yes, as a writer, what I think is interesting is when you turn that dial, how you reinvent all these elements of craft, your dialogue, your setting, your characterization, your communication of ideas, your metaphors and allegories and allusions and similes and all these various elements of poetics. How do you retool them for this story of these people at this time. And that's, part of the fun for me and hopefully fun for the reader, so that, if someone's a fan of A Gentleman in Moscow or Rules of Civility, I think they will find that The Lincoln Highway is clearly my book. They will recognize it as my work, but they will also see that quite quickly that, artistically speaking, it's very different than the other two, just as they were different from each other. And that hopefully is something that they'll enjoy, that experience of difference.
Interesting. So what's your next book going to be?
Different.
That's it? No more
That's
details.
it.
Okay. What made you go from the world of finance to writing? And then now that you're here, what advice would you have for aspiring authors?
Well, I've been writing since I was a kid. So I wrote fiction in elementary school, and high school, and college, and graduate school. So really, that's the thing I've been doing all my life. And my childhood friends, what they find surprising is that I was in the investment business for 20 years. That's what shocks them. But so, I'm not a great font for advice, source for advice. But, for me, what worked for me was basically read, write, repeat, So from the time I was in first grade, I would read something, and if it grabbed me, I'd read more of it. And then I would probably start writing in some fashion, drawing from what I just read as an experiment or as thievery or whatever you want to call it. And that just sort of, that began around the time I was in first grade and continued right through to today. I'm constantly reading books with the interest, not only of enjoying them, but of understanding how they work and how an author approaches their craft, how they realize the intrinsic mission of their books. And that inevitably influences me, and shapes kind of how I might, it's one thing I get to carry into the next project is how that person did that. I'm not copying people. I make it sound like that, but I'm 57. So I'm talking about after decades of reading, you've accumulated a large vocabulary of different styles of storytelling, different approaches to storytelling. And that helps me when I set out and invent an idea and I have to start thinking about how do I tell this? I can draw on this sort of longstanding awareness and of different types of storytelling that might serve the purposes of this tale.
Very interesting. Well, I feel like one of the things that you do particularly well is developing your characters and how real they become and how quickly you're able to introduce us to them. Like we feel like you get to know them very quickly with just a few details or a few sentences that they say. You within a page or two, like I totally got to know Duchess, right? Like that's who that person is. I know the backstory. He's funny, like all the things. Like it's very impressive because sometimes it takes a while to get to know people. I don't know. So I feel like that's one of the most vivid things in your writing. But
well, I appreciate you saying that. But I'm glad that's your experience, but because that's certainly the intention. I think that one of the elements of the novel that are most important and they're most unique, or an element which is is among the most important and is the most unique, is what you're describing, which is that the novel is an art form in which we can take the perspective of a different human being, where we suddenly can see the world through their eyes. We can feel in the best of novels very close to their experience. We feel emotionally in tune with them. So if they have a setback, we're upset. If they have a victory, we're excited. If something funny happens to them, we laugh. If something tragic happens to them, we cry. There's a real potential bonding between a reader and central characters. And when that happens, it's a beautiful thing, I think, and can make a story much more powerful. So I do think that for young writers, this should be one of the things that they strive to gain a command of, which is how do you invent a personality, so a three-dimensional individual, idiosyncratic, is unique, and yet the reader gets access very quickly to an understanding of who they are. Now, part of the pleasure of a novel is getting a deeper and deeper understanding of who they are and watching how they change. So it's not like you need to know everything.
Right.
But as you say, you want to know enough about them that you kind of have a sense of, oh yeah, okay, I know, I can feel who this person is. I know who this person is, and now I'm going to join them in this discovery, and I'm going to get to know them better along the way, much in the way that we do in life. If particularly when we hit it off with somebody, you spend 40 minutes at a party talking to somebody who's a natural fit for you, and it's just like it's very exciting. You feel like I feel like I've known this person their whole lives, and you realize there's many things you still need to know about them, and and they are changing. but yet you have this strong sense of affinity, and I think in writing, you're trying to create that similar version of that experience, but you just, the challenge is that you have to make that connection, that aspect of affinity for all kinds of readers at the same time.
Yeah.
I can't sort of just make 1 in 1,000 people like my main character. It does have to be ideally a broader scope than that.
It's really like magic that it ever works, really. I mean, when you think about it.
It is. It's very much like magic.
Anyway, well, Amor, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for all the hours of reading pleasure you've given me on your...
Thank you, Zibby. Thanks for having me.
So thanks so much. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens and at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Also sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com and sign up for my virtual book club and meet lots of authors on Zoom every other week. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music.